There are two sources of instability in the case of the Sino-Indian relationship. The first source of instability is what arises from what China decides to do in terms of its own nuclear modernization vis-à-vis the United States. It's very clear that China does not consider India to be primarily a nuclear threat, although it is very conscious of the fact that India has nuclear weapons and therefore must be deterred. But the principal threat for China is still the United States. And so Chinese nuclear modernization today, which is aimed primarily at neutralizing US nuclear threats, will have a knock-on effect on India's own nuclear preparations. We do not know what the long-term future of the Chinese nuclear force is, because China's own nuclear modernization is a work in progress. But depending on how that modernization evolves, it will stimulate, at the very least, Indian counteraction. And so I expect to see a progressive enlargement of the Indian nuclear arsenal to deal with this Chinese force. I don't think it'll be symmetrical. I don't think it'll be matching warhead for warhead. But I do think it will compel India to engage in a larger modernization than it had initially planned. The second dimension of instability really arises from the way the two countries manage their border dispute. Because so far, the border dispute has actually been contained in that there is political disagreement, but it has not degenerated into actual violence along those borders. Should that change, and Indian and Chinese military actions along their borders result in actual armed conflict, even if it is small-scale armed conflict, I think it's going to change the Indian calculation and also the Chinese calculation with respect to both nuclear readiness and nuclear deployments. And so I think the way border management evolves in the next decade will have an interesting bearing on the future disposition of Chinese and Indian nuclear forces as well.
The development of MIRVs in China is obviously viewed with a certain amount of concern by India, largely because if China professes a no first use doctrine and MIRVs are essentially first strike weapons, then it becomes a mismatch, and then it leads to the possibility of China giving up its no first use doctrine at some time in the future. As I mentioned earlier, India and China derive a lot of nuclear stability from the doctrinal consonants of no first use. And if there was a fear that China was going to give up its no first use because it's developing MIRV capability, which is essentially for first strike, then it causes disquiet in India.
To describe the water disputes between China and India and how they affect bilateral relations. Basically, China-India actually shares mainly three rivers, which is the Indus, with the Brahmaputra as well, and also the Sutlej. The reason is because these rivers actually flow from the Tibetan Plateau in China. Of these rivers, the one that's most important and most significant is actually the Brahmaputra River, because it has a mean annual runoff of 165.4 cubic kilometers. Now, how does that affect China's and India's China-India relations? Is that basically both countries, it is one issue that is tied up with Arunachal Pradesh, which is an area that is disputed between China and India, with India occupying it, but China laying claims on it. So any effort to develop the watershed in Arunachal Pradesh is seen as India trying to strengthen its claims there, and China sees it as complicating their negotiations on border issues with India. It is significant also because China is the upstream riparian, and it is also economically and militarily more powerful than India. As such, this means that India gets really worried when China builds dams. There's also talk of China diverting the water of the Brahmaputra for a water project in China itself. These things caused the Indians to be worried that the flow towards India will be affected.
There's a high level of mistrust resulting from the fact that China and India still have not been able to settle their outstanding border dispute. For India, this causes a lot of concern because China has been able to settle border disputes with nearly every single other one of its neighboring states. Because this border dispute remains still to be finalized, there are several examples of patrols on both sides going forward into what each other perceive as their territory, getting caught, and either deciding to go back or deciding to stay put and have a standoff for a few weeks, which raises tensions between the two states. Second to that is, again, within India, the sense that China is gradually increasing its maritime incursions around the Indian coastline. There was an example a few years ago of Chinese submarines sniffing around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, especially given the Chinese pretext for its Indian Ocean forays that this is only solely about piracy. Yet there's piracy around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I think, and using submarines to sniff around is hardly credible in that light. One other source is the fact that China still refuses to recognize India as a nuclear weapon state. There are multiple dialogues that China and India will have on nuclear issues, and they will cover non-proliferation, nuclear energy, nuclear security, and then the Indian official will try to move on to things like strategic stability, nuclear confidence building measures, and the Chinese official will say this is an inappropriate thing to talk about. They see recognizing India as a pure nuclear weapon state as kind of legitimizing in a way, and they don't see India as being a pure threat as the same way that they do the United States. This in itself breeds further mistrust in India and further concern and anxiety about China's intentions. On top of this is the long-running, by now decades-long history of Chinese nuclear and missile assistance to Pakistan, which has now taken on a different dimension through CPEC, and having thousands of Chinese troops now passing through parts of Kashmir, which India claims as its own, and within Pakistani territory itself. This sense of, compared with a maritime element from the south and CPEC from the north, this sense of gradual encirclement around India further elevates anxiety within India regarding China's intentions. With regard to how China views India, India has responded to this in the recent decade by really strengthening its force presence along the China-India border. And Chinese analysts are convinced that this is not due to any Chinese actions by themselves, but to the United States whispering in India's ear that it should adopt a stronger front against China, and that this, according to Chinese analysts, goes against India's own interest in doing so.